Welcome to BeFM Drama, where we turn great literature into gripping radio. In today's episode, we bring you part 3 in our 5-part adaptation of The Adventure of the Abbey Grange, a classic Sherlock Holmes mystery. Holmes and Watson have been called to investigate a murder at a stately country home, the Abbey Grange, where the Lord Brackenstall has been murdered. It appears to be a case of a botched home invasion by a gang of burglars, and the witness to the crime, Lady Brackenstall, has given a convincing account of what occurred. Even so, Holmes seems troubled by the case. The burglars drank wine together before they fled the scene, and something about the glasses has left the great detective feeling uneasy about the case. As we began our return journey to London, I could see by Holmes's face that he was badly puzzled by something which he had observed at Abbey Grange. Every now and then, by an effort, he would throw off the feeling and talk as if the matter were clear. But then his doubts would settle down on him again, and his knitted brows and troubled eyes would show that his thoughts had gone back once more to the great dining room of the Abbey Grange, where this midnight tragedy had been enacted. At last, by a sudden impulse, just as our train was crawling out of a suburban station, he jumped out the carriage door onto the platform and pulled me out after him. We watched as the rear carriages of our London-bound train disappeared around the curve. I shivered in the winter cold. I assume you have a good reason why we're no longer sitting comfortably in our cozy first-class compartment?
Excuse me, my dear fellow. I'm sorry to make you the victim of what may seem a sudden whim, but on my life, Watson, I simply can't leave the case in this condition. Every instinct that I have cries out against it. It's wrong. It's all wrong. I'll swear to you that it's wrong. And yet the lady's story was complete. The maid's corroboration was complete, and the detail was fairly exact. What evidence do I have against that? 3 wine glasses, that is all. I was bored by it, Watson. The case seemed already solved. If I had not taken things for granted, if I had not approached it as a cut-and-dried case of bungled robbery, I might have discovered more definitive evidence. Of course I would have. Sit down on this bench, Watson, until the next train for Chislehurst arrives, and allow me to lay the evidence before you. Please, dismiss from your mind the assumption that everything in The Maid and Her Mistress said must necessarily be true. This lady's charming personality must not be permitted to warp our judgment.
I'll humor you, Holmes, but Hopkins' case does appear to be sound.
Surely there are details of her story which, if looked at objectively, excite some suspicion. These burglars made off with a considerable haul at Sydenham a fortnight ago. Some detail of their appearance was in the newspapers and would naturally occur to anyone in the area who wished to invent a story in which imaginary robbers played a part. As a matter of fact, burglars who had done such a successful job are, as a rule, only too glad to enjoy their money in peace and quiet without immediately launching on another risky crime. It is unusual for burglars to operate so early, before midnight. It is unusual for burglars to strike a lady to prevent her from screaming, since one would imagine that would be the surest way to make her scream. It is unusual for them to commit murder when their numbers are sufficient to overpower one man. It is unusual for them to be content with a limited plunder when there is so much more value within their reach. And finally, I should say that it was very unusual for such men to leave a bottle half empty. How do all of these unusuals strike you, Watson?
Well, taken together they seem significant, yet each of them is quite possible in itself. The most unusual thing of all, it seems to me, is that the lady should be tied to a chair.
Well, I am not so clear about that, Watson, for it was clear they must either kill her or else secure her in such a way that she should not raise immediate alarm. But at any rate, haven't I shown that there is a certain element of improbability about the lady's story? And now, on top of this, comes the incident of the wine glasses.
What about the wine glasses?
Can you see them in your mind's eye?
I see them clearly.
We are told that 3 men drank from them. Did that strike you as likely?
Why not? There was wine in each glass.
Exactly, but there were bee-swing dregs only in 1 glass. You must have noticed that fact. What does that suggest to your mind?
Well, the last glass filled would be the most likely to contain beeswing.
Not at all. The bottle was an old one and full of sediment. It is inconceivable that the first 2 glasses were clear and the third heavily mixed with it. There are 2 possible explanations, and only 2. One is that after the second glass was filled, the bottle was violently shaken, and so the third glass received the B-swing. That does not appear probable. No, I am sure that I am right.
What then do you suppose?
That only 2 glasses were used, and that the dregs of both were poured into a third glass so as to give the false impression that 3 people had been there. In that way, all the sediment would be in the last glass, would it not? Yes, I am convinced that it is so. But if I have hit upon the true explanation, it can only mean that Lady Brackenstall and her maid have deliberately lied to us. That not one word of their story is to be believed. That they have some very strong reason for covering for the real criminal, and we must construct our case for ourselves without any help from them. That is the mission which now lies before us, and why we've left the comfort of our London-bound carriage. And here, Watson, is the train back to Sydenham.
The household at the Abbey Grange was much surprised at our return, but Sherlock Holmes, finding that Stanley Hopkins had left to report back to headquarters, took possession of the dining room, locked the door from the inside, and devoted himself for 2 hours to a careful and laborious investigation. Seated in a corner like an interested student observing the demonstration of a professor, I followed every step of his remarkable research. The window, the curtains, the carpet, the chair, the rope, each in turn was minutely examined and duly pondered. The body of the unfortunate baronet had been removed, and all else remained exactly as we had seen it that morning. Finally, to my astonishment, Holmes climbed up onto the massive mantelpiece. Far above his head hung the few inches of red cord which were still attached to the wire of the bell pull. For a long time he gazed upward at it, and then, in an attempt to get nearer, he rested his knee upon a wooden bracket on the wall. This brought his hand within a few inches of the broken end of the rope, but it was not this so much as the bracket itself which seemed to engage his attention. Finally he sprang down with a sigh of satisfaction.
It's all right, Watson. We have got our case, one of the most remarkable in our collection. But dear me, how slow-witted I have been, and how nearly I have committed the blunder of my lifetime. Now, I think that with a few missing links, my chain is almost complete.
Have you got your men?
Man, Watson, man. Only one, but a very formidable person. Strong as a lion. Witness the blows that bent that poker. 6'3" in height, active as a squirrel, dexterous with his fingers. Finally, remarkably quick-witted, for this whole ingenious story is his concoction. Yes, Watson, we have come upon the handiwork of a very remarkable individual. And yet in that bell rope he has given us a clue which should not have left us a doubt.
Where was the clue?
Well, if you were to pull down a bell rope, Watson, where would you expect it to break? Surely at the spot where it's attached to the wire. Why should it break 3 inches from the top as this one is done?
Because it is frayed there?
Exactly. This end, which we can examine, is frayed. He was cunning enough to do that with his knife, but the other end is not frayed. You could not observe that from here, but if you were standing on the mantelpiece, you would see that it is cut clean off without any mark of fraying whatsoever. You can reconstruct what occurred. The man needed the rope. He would not tear it down for fear of raising the alarm by ringing the bell. What did he do? He sprang up on the mantelpiece. He could not quite reach it. He put his knee on the bracket. You will see the impression on the dust, and so cut his knife upon the cord. I cannot reach the place by at least 3 inches, and so I infer that he is at least 3 inches taller than I. Look at that mark upon the seat of the chair. What is it?
Blood.
Yes, it is blood. This alone puts the lady's story out of court. If she was seated on the chair when the crime was done, how did that bloodstain come to be there? No. She was placed in the chair after the death of her husband. I'll wager that her black dress shows a corresponding mark to this one. Ah, this case begins in my defeat but ends in victory. Now I should like to have a few words with the nurse, Teresa. We must be very wary for a while if we are to get the information which we want.
Holmes has determined that things are not what they seem to be at Abbey Grange, and has concluded that the Lady Brackenstall and her maid, Nurse Wright, are concealing something about the death of her husband, a man who was, by all accounts, an abusive drunk, who none in the household at Abbey Grange will mourn the passing of. Why has the lady given false testimony, and what were the true circumstances of her husband's death? Join us tomorrow evening to find out on part 4 of The Adventure of the Abbey Grange here on BeFM Drama.